Get ready for a story that challenges everything you think about power, success, and downfall. Imagine a man who rose to the height of the ancient world. He had it all: a colossal empire, countless riches, impenetrable walls, and a name that made entire nations tremble. He was the absolute ruler of Babylon, a king who believed his glory was unshakable. But then, something unthinkable happened. In a single moment, he lost everything, not to an enemy army, not to internal betrayal, but to something that no human power could stop. He ceased to be a king. Worse, he ceased to be a man. This is the incredible story of Nebuchadnezzar, the king who, at the height of his pride, was reduced to a savage being. He roamed the fields like an animal, lost his sanity, fed on grass, his nails grew like claws, and his hair became feathers. From supreme ruler to irrational creature, he experienced firsthand what it means to lose everything. But why did this happen? What led the most powerful man in the world to fall so brutally? And most importantly, what lesson did this story leave for us? Few people know this story in depth, and even fewer understand what it really means. But if you think this is just an old story, you are mistaken. What happened to Nebuchadnezzar happens to this day in different forms. Pride continues to bring people down, and life continues to teach us the hard way. But there is something powerful in this story, a key that can change the way you see the world. And in the end, the big question will be, do you need to fall to learn, or can you learn before the fall? Babylon was not just a city, it was a grand, imposing, unassailable empire. At the center of this colossus was Nebuchadnezzar, a king whose authority knew no bounds. He built walls so wide that chariots could ride alongside them, fortresses that defied time, and hanging gardens that dazzled the world. His fame transcended borders, his name was feared. An absolute ruler, he dominated entire nations with the strength of his army and the cunning of his strategic mind. If power had a face in those days, it would be his. But power without control is a silent trap. The grandeur of Babylon was not enough to quench Nebuchadnezzar's thirst for glory. He did not want to simply conquer lands. He wanted to shape history with his own hands, to be remembered as someone who built an immortal empire. His name echoed in the halls of Babylon like a god among men. Each victory reinforced his belief that he was invincible. His kingdom was strong, his word was law, and anyone who dared to challenge his authority was doomed to ruin. And so, like many before and after him, the king began to believe that his success was solely the work of his own genius. He saw himself as the architect of his greatness, the sole person responsible for his rise. But destiny, or rather a force much greater than himself, was about to show that no man, no matter how powerful, reigns supreme forever. Nebuchadnezzar's pride was not only evident, it was the essence of his existence. The king saw his empire as a monument to his own genius. He walked through the halls of the palace, admiring every detail and thinking, "All this is the fruit of my hands, my power, my intelligence." It was not enough to be the most powerful man on earth. He wanted to be immortalized, remembered as someone who forged his own destiny without needing anything other than his own strength. Pride blinded him, and when a man sees himself as greater than he really is, his downfall becomes only a matter of time. The problem with self-sufficiency is that it gives a false sense of control. How many leaders, business people, and successful people have not fallen into this same trap? Thinking that they have reached the top on their own, they forget that life is unpredictable, that the wheel of destiny turns without asking permission. Nebuchadnezzar believed that nothing could remove him from his throne. After all, who would dare challenge him? He did not realize that the greatest threat came not from without, but from within, from his own arrogance. And when a man becomes Deaf to any warning, the warning must come in a form that he cannot ignore. The warning came in an unexpected way, a dream. But it was no ordinary dream. It was not a simple reverie of the mind, a passing illusion. It was an omen, a disturbing enigma that even in the greatness of his royalty made him feel something he had not felt for a long time: fear. And when a powerful man fears something he cannot understand, he finds himself forced to seek answers, even if they are not what he wants to hear. That night, Nebuchadnezzar slept, but his mind did not rest. The dream he had had was so vivid, so intense, that the king woke up with his heart racing and a chill down his spine. He saw a colossal, gigantic tree with firm roots and branches that spread to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were lush, its fruits fed all living beings, animals sheltered in its shade, birds nested in its branches. The tree was a symbol of life, prosperity, and unparalleled strength. It was unshakable, until suddenly a voice from the heavens echoed like thunder. "Cut down the tree, cut off its branches, scatter its fruits, but leave the stump and the roots chained with iron and bronze." The king tossed and turned in bed, feeling that this was more than just an ordinary dream. He did not know what it meant, but one thing was certain: it was not good, and the voice continued, "Let him be wet with the dew of heaven and live among the animals. Let his mind be transformed and his heart become like that of a beast, until 7 times pass over him." What did that mean? Who was this he who would lose his human identity and become an animal? Nebuchadnezzar, accustomed to always having all the answers, now found himself a prisoner of a riddle that not all the gold in Babylon could solve. Disturbed and restless, he immediately summoned his wise men, magicians, and soothsayers. He wanted answers. He needed to know the meaning of that vision, but no one, absolutely no one, was able to interpret. The king, who had always been feared, now feared something that was beyond his power. It was then that, almost as a last attempt, someone suggested a name, a man who had already proven to have access to higher revelations, someone who could decipher this mystery. His name, Daniel. Before the king, Daniel listened attentively to the description of the dream. But unlike the soothsayers and magicians who had come before him, Daniel did not hesitate. His face, however, showed something unusual: grief. He knew that this dream was no ordinary message. It was a divine decree, and it was not good news for Nebuchadnezzar. After an uneasy silence, Daniel looked the king in the eye and said, "My lord, would that this dream were for your enemies, and not for you." But the truth could not be sugar-coated. The great tree represented Nebuchadnezzar himself. His glory, his power, his influence were as vast as the branches of that tree. But just as in the dream, that greatness was about to be cut down. Daniel went on to explain what this meant. The king would lose his sanity, live like an animal, far from his position of honor. He would wander the fields with no understanding of his own identity, no control over his mind or body. This would last 7 years, or 7 times, until he recognized a non-negotiable truth: the Most High rules over the kingdoms of men and gives them to whomever he wishes. The lesson was clear. Nebuchadnezzar might be a great king, but he was not absolute sovereign. Above all human reigns, there is a greater government. Faced with such a revelation, Daniel made an appeal. He asked the king to change his ways, to abandon his arrogance, to practice justice and help those in need. Perhaps in this way, judgment could be delayed or avoided. But the heart of a powerful man rarely bends before his fall. And time began to tick, bringing Nebuchadnezzar ever closer to the day when his reality would change forever. Time passed, and nothing happened. Days turned into months, and months into an entire year. Nebuchadnezzar, confident as ever, walked along the terrace of his imposing palace, contemplating the grandeur of Babylon. His eyes roamed the impenetrable walls, the colossal temples, the gardens that defied nature. And then, with a smile of satisfaction, he proclaimed, "Is not this great Babylon that I have built for my glory and majesty, with the power of my own hands?" It was as if he were defying destiny itself, but he had barely finished his sentence when a voice resounded from the heavens, interrupting his exaltation. "O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is declared, your kingdom is taken from you." The silence that followed was terrifying. The advisors, the servants, the guards, everyone froze. The king, who moments before had seen himself as a god among men, now felt something different, a dizziness, a void in his mind. His vision began to blur, his rationality slipped like sand through his fingers. What was happening? He tried to understand, tried to hold on, but something inside him was shattering. Daniel's prophecy was not an empty threat. It was being fulfilled there, in front of everyone. Nebuchadnezzar staggered. His thoughts lost coherence. His voice became a meaningless murmur. The most powerful man in the world was, in an instant, no longer a man. His servants screamed. The court went into an uproar. But no one could stop what was about to happen. The king of Babylon, the conqueror of nations, was falling not by an enemy's sword, but by something he could never fight, the hand of God himself. The mighty king of Babylon, who had once ruled with an iron fist, now wandered aimlessly. His dirty body, his fragmented mind, his eyes that had once been filled with authority, now reflected the emptiness of someone who no longer knew who he was. He was cast out of the palace, shunned from society, left to fend for himself. His royal robes were replaced by the fur of the earth, and his home was the open field. The great monarch, the man who gave orders to armies, now lived among the animals, crawling on the ground, unaware of his former glory. Over time, his appearance became as wild as his mind. His hair grew wildly, becoming like eagle feathers. His nails, once well-groomed, grew longer and curved like the claws of a predator. He no longer ate the delicacies of royalty, but fed on the grass of the field, like oxen. The natural cycle of time no longer made sense to him. Days and nights blended together in an existence without purpose, without reason. The one who had once been exalted as a demigod was now incapable of articulating a single coherent sentence. Nebuchadnezzar's fall was not just physical or mental, it was a total collapse. His fate was a living reminder to all. No one, no matter how great, is above divine justice. But that was not the end of the story. The prophecy spoke of 7 years, 7 times of humiliation, 7 years of forced learning. The question was, after so long in the darkness, would he be able to return to the light? Days turned into months, months into years. 7 long years, in which Nebuchadnezzar was no longer recognized as king and was seen as a wild creature. Babylon went on without him. Advisors took over the government, the palace continued to function, and the world seemed to forget him. Those who had once revered him now spoke of him with pity, perhaps even contempt. His name, once synonymous with power, had become a warning about the dangers of pride. A man who had seen himself as a god now lived like an animal. This time of humiliation was not only a punishment, but a lesson. 7 years without control, without power, without a voice. 7 years for him to understand that true sovereignty was not in his hands. It is interesting to note how often the greatest transformations happen in pain, loss, and loneliness. How many people go through similar processes? They lose everything, hit rock bottom, and only then begin to see clearly. The big difference is that some rebel while others learn. The question was, which path would Nebuchadnezzar choose? And then, after this long period of humiliation, something changed. The same man who had reduced himself to the status of a wild beast began to show signs of consciousness. His mind, previously fragmented, began to rebuild itself. For the first time in years, he raised his eyes to the heavens, and it was at that moment that the true transformation took place. After 7 years of wandering as a shadow of his former self, something extraordinary happened. Nebuchadnezzar, for the first time in all that time, raised his eyes to the heavens. It was a simple gesture, but loaded with meaning. He, who had previously only looked at himself, at his achievements, at his power, now recognized something greater, and in that instant his mind returned. As if a thick fog had dissipated, he regained his sanity. The confused voices disappeared, the wild instincts were silenced. He understood. Finally, he understood. The king not only regained his reason, he gained something he had never had before: humility. His first act upon coming to his senses was not to claim his throne, nor to try to reclaim his glory, but to recognize that true power was not in his hands. He raised his hands to heaven and declared, "Now I know that there is a sovereign God who rules over all and whom no one can resist." Nebuchadnezzar, who had once said, "I built this great Babylon," now said, "To him belongs all the glory." He was no longer a king dominated by pride, but a man transformed by the truth. And so it was that instead of being left forever in ruin, he was restored. His rule was restored to him, but now he ruled with a different heart. Arrogance had been replaced by gratitude, pride by gratitude. He was back on the throne, but not as the same man who had fallen. The experience of humiliation was not in vain. It shaped him to be someone greater than before. Nebuchadnezzar's return to the throne was something few could have imagined. A king who had lost everything. His sanity, his glory, his respect, was now back in power, but not as before. If before he had ruled with an iron fist and a heart full of pride, now his gaze reflected wisdom. The kingdom that seemed lost was restored. His advisors returned to serve him, his people returned to respect him, and his influence grew even more. But this time, he did not see all this as the fruit of his own genius, but rather as something granted by the true King of Kings. He did something that no other great ruler of the time would dare to do. He publicly admitted his failure. Instead of hiding his story, he proclaimed it to the world. He ordered that it be recorded and spread that his pride had led him to destruction, but his humility had brought him back. For a king, admitting weakness was unthinkable. But Nebuchadnezzar no longer saw it as weakness. He understood that there is no shame in acknowledging the truth, and that true strength comes from humility. Now his greatness was no longer in his achievements, but in the transformation he experienced. His reign continued, but his vision had changed. He governed with an understanding that few leaders had. He knew that Babylon, however great it might be, would one day fall, that empires come and go, that time corrodes the greatest fortifications. But something would remain, the lesson that his life left for future generations. And the most curious thing, he who wanted to be immortalized through power achieved this through something much greater: his story. The story of Nebuchadnezzar is not just an ancient story about a powerful king. It is a mirror of human reality. How many people do not live like he did? Building personal empires, thinking themselves self-sufficient, believing that everything they achieved was exclusively due to their own strength. But pride blinds, and life has relentless ways of teaching humility. Some falls come subtly, others overwhelmingly. The fact is that no one is immune to this cycle. The more one exalts oneself, the harder one will fall. What happened to Nebuchadnezzar is a reminder that true success comes not from strength or intelligence alone, but from the ability to recognize that there is something greater than oneself. How many people, when they have lost everything, a job, a business, a relationship, their health, finally realize that they were building on a shaky foundation? Pride leads to ruin, but humility brings restoration. The king had to lose his sanity to find the truth. And today, many people live trapped in their own illusions of control until life shows them that they were never really in charge. The big question is, do we have to fall in order to learn? Or can we learn first by looking at the history of those who came before us? Nebuchadnezzar had a second chance, but not everyone does. And the decision to change, to recognize the true source of power and wisdom, can be made now. Because pride destroys, but humility rebuilds. And whoever understands this before the fall saves himself from unnecessary ruin. And now, after knowing this incredible story, the big question arises: do you need to fall in order to learn? Nebuchadnezzar ignored the signs, blindly trusted in his own power, and paid the price. But what about you? How many times has life given you little warnings that you chose to ignore? How many times have you felt unshakable, as if nothing could touch you, only to realizing later that you were more vulnerable than you imagined? Pride blinds, and falling is inevitable for those who insist on walking alone. But here's the good news. You don't have to wait for a fall to understand this lesson. The story of Nebuchadnezzar shows us that true greatness is not in accumulating achievements, but in recognizing that there is something greater than ourselves. You can choose to learn now, to adjust your path before life forces you to do so. Maybe it's time to reflect. In which areas of your life have you been acting like an invincible king without realizing that you may be about to stumble? What can you change today to avoid an unnecessary fall tomorrow? If this story made you think, if it generated that good discomfort, then it's time to act. And if you want to continue learning about these stories that change the way we see the world, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because this was just one of many powerful lessons that we still have to share. And remember, it's better to learn through wisdom than through pain. The choice is yours.